Hello, I would like to welcome you on today's lecture. I have an honor to introduce to you our distinguished guest, Professor Omer Bartow, who is John P. Berglund Distinguished Professor of History, of European History and Professor of German Studies at Brown University. Professor Bartow was born in Israel and educated at the Tel Aviv University, but he also graduated from the St. Anthony's College in Oxford. And his early research concentrated on the Nazi introduction of the Wehrmacht and the crimes it committed during the Second World War. Later, he turned into the links between genocide and total war. And about his recent book, I will tell you in a moment. I just wanted to let you know that this lecture today is a part of Pauline Museum's Distinguished Lecture Series, which are a part of the Global Education Outreach Program. These lectures to present, we invite the most important scholars of Jewish history, of Jewish Polish studies. And I think I missed an important fact. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Michał Trębacz. I am the head of the research department at the Pauline Museum. And about today's lecture, I think that this is a very important subject. This is a subject that is still being analyzed here in Poland, and we have a live discussion how to approach the testimonies of victims and of the survivors. And Professor Bartow will tell us about this also. And he will speak on the basis of his most recent monography. This is the Anatomy of a Genocide, the life and death of a town called Buchacz, which is a microhistory, as you can see from the title itself, but a microhistory of ethnic coexistence and violence. The book was very well received. It was awarded with the National Jewish Book Award and the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research. And it has been translated into several languages, among them also into Polish. So Professor Bartow today will speak about how the testimonies of ordinary men, ordinary people, can reshape or rewrite the history of the Holocaust. And I just wanted to tell you that we will have the lecture for about an hour. And during the lecture, we have a live chat where you can ask your questions. And after the lecture, we will have a Q&A session for about half an hour. And that's all from me. So, Professor Bartow, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michał, and thank you very much for those who are listening. I will speak today about several topics. And before I begin, I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you. Let me just find it. Yes. Michał, can this be seen?
Yes, everything's okay.
Okay, good. So what I will talk about today is, and I believe that's the official title of my talk, is what I call Genocide from Below, Rewriting the Holocaust as First-Person Local History. And what you're looking at, of course, is not a book that I recently published, but something that I published a long time ago, and I will explain in a moment why I want to start there. So basically, the components of what I would like to speak about today are the idea of a history from below, the idea of writing a local history, and the notion of writing a first-person history. And all those are connected to each other. And in my own, I would say, my own scholarly trajectory, I have developed over time a certain concept of how to approach this kind of historiography, that is, of writing history from below, what the Germans call Geschichte von unten, writing a local history and writing a first-person history. And, when we get to a certain point in our life, we, certainly as academics, but not only as academics, we look back at what we did over the years and we try to find some logical sequence of events that may not have been planned in advance. It was not in my case, but one can identify a certain logic, a certain progression of events. And as I was writing the last book that Michal mentioned, Anatomy of a Genocide, I increasingly became aware of its links to my much earlier work when I was still writing my dissertation at Oxford in the early 1980s. Now, that dissertation eventually came out as the book that you're seeing here, The Eastern Front, 1941-45, that was published in 1985, and then another book that used similar materials, but not a different argument, but sharpened the argument quite a bit. It came out in 1991, Hitler's Army. Now, the reason I mention this is that at the time, I had a particular question as I was setting out to write my own dissertation, and the question was, can one believe what the general notion was in Germany at the time, that the German military had nothing to do with crimes on the Eastern Front, but those were committed in the back of the army, behind the back of the fighting soldiers, by the SS, by the Einsatzgruppen, and so forth. That was obviously a highly contentious question, because unlike the SS or the Gestapo, the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, in many ways represented all of German society. There were over about 20 million Germans who went through the ranks of the Wehrmacht during the war. Now, I was not the first person to ask that question. And as you can see, there were some very important works that were published in Germany in the years before I started my dissertation, and I was certainly influenced by them. And they included an important work by Christian Streit, Keine Kameraden, which was really about the maltreatment of Soviet POWs, prisoners of war, by the Wehrmacht. Over 3 million prisoners of war died in German hands, in the hands of the German military. So that was a very important book. A second important book was on the indoctrination of soldiers in the Wehrmacht by Manfred Messerschmitt. That was published in 1969, again showing that there was an attempt to Nazify the German armed forces. And a third important book by Krausnick and Wilhelm, Die Truppe des Weltanschauungskrieges, was about the cooperation between the Wehrmacht and the Einsatzgruppe. Again, a very important study. The difference between what these German scholars did and what I tried to do was that they looked at that contentious, problematic historiography that remained very contentious years after my own study and several other studies were published in the 80s and led to another controversy in the late 1990s in Germany. The reason for that was that they looked very much from the top, and what they showed was that there were attempts at the higher echelons of the Wehrmacht to involve the German military, both in ideological indoctrination and in the crimes of what Hitler called the Vernichtungskrieg, the war of extermination in the East. But that did not mean that this had any effect on the troops on the ground. And what I tried to do is to look at that from below. That is to see what happened on the ground. Were soldiers influenced by this indoctrination? And did this indoctrination then affect the way they behaved? That is, were they actually engaged in committing crimes on a large scale? Because the Wehrmacht was a huge organization with millions of soldiers and hundreds of divisions, it was impossible to study it from below as a whole. And so what I chose to do was a history from below that was, in a sense, a local history. That is, I studied only 3 divisions that I claimed were more or less representative of combat divisions, those that were fighting at the front, those who were actually engaged in the fighting, not any forces that were behind the front. What I concluded was that indeed the soldiers were highly indoctrinated, and this had to do both with the fact that they were young men, both the officers and the enlisted men. So they were already indoctrinated in the 1930s. They then went through a process of indoctrination within the ranks of the Wehrmacht. They were also greatly affected by the conditions at the front. I won't go into all the details of why that happened, but largely this notion of a primary group loyalty, that they were fighting really because of their loyalty to their comrades, did not really persist because of the very high losses at the front, so that manpower replacement was very rapid. And as a result of that, they were motivated much more, I argued, by a sort of larger notion of why they were there and what they were there to do. And that finally, that they were involved in or they had mass engagement in crimes against civilian populations, against prisoners of war, and they were also engaged in either killing or identifying Jews in areas that they moved into and handing them over to other parts of the German occupation apparatus that murdered them. So this, for me, was my first engagement in this notion of what is a combination of a history from below that is looking at the small people, at the menu peuple, at the little guys at the bottom of history, those who are subjected to history but also make history on the one hand, and looking at them as a local case. Now, it was not a local history in the sense that was common then, that you choose a certain town or a certain village and you study them. You can't do that in the military, but rather choosing certain military formations and trying to find out everything you can about these formations, about the people who were there and what they did, and arguing that by doing that, you can make a larger argument about the army as a whole. Now, quite a few years later, I started thinking about this study, about anatomy of a genocide, and I will take you through some of the arguments that I made and why, in this case, it became both a local history and increasingly what I see as a first-person history, as a history using individual accounts. I did that in the earlier research. I was trying to find as much as I could on members of these units that I studied in the German army, but that was more difficult in that case than in the case of Anatomy of a Genocide. Now, I would just say, and that's why I'm showing you the covers of the translations of the book, that for me it was quite interesting. This is a study of one town, not very well known. It's known in Israel for reasons I will mention in a moment, but generally it's not a particularly well-known town. When I speak about it in the United States, nobody's ever heard of it, or in Germany or in France. And yet the book was seen by many of its reviewers, I think rightly, as a book that said something that was beyond the case of that town, that was much more about a certain understanding of the Holocaust, and I will talk about that in the last part of this lecture. But beyond that also, it's something that told us, or a study that told us something about the vulnerabilities of any society, and particularly of multi-ethnic societies, and how they can, over time, deteriorate from societies of coexistence into societies of mutual murder. And that was identified by a variety of critics, whether it was in France or in Germany or in Poland and in the United States and Britain. It was interesting for me that there was slightly less attention paid to that with the Hebrew edition of the book, and we can talk about why perhaps in the questions. And I'm still waiting, as I indicate here. I would very much like to have a Ukrainian translation of the book, since these events take place in an area that is now Ukraine, as I will show in a minute. But I think that partly because of economic and political conditions, and partly because of local sensibilities, that has still not come about. I also want to just very quickly note here, before I get into the meat of this lecture, that as I mentioned, I'm seeing this as part of a trajectory that began with the study of the Wehrmacht and then went on quite a few years later into the study of genocide in a local case of the Holocaust in Ukraine. I have tried to take this in several other directions, and I will mention that briefly. One most relevant to the case of Buchach and of local genocide is this book that came out last June, Voices on War and Genocide. This is an edited volume that includes 3 diaries. Anyone who read Anatomy of a Genocide will find that I quote a little bit from those diaries, but I could not obviously bring as much as I wanted from those diaries. They are rare and important, and they provide a look from within of what happens in a locality during time of war and genocide. And this book covers both World War I and World War II, and of course the Holocaust. And it's really the diary of a Polish headmaster from Buchach, who reports most extensively on the Russian occupation of the town in World War I, and then the conflict between Poland and the Ukrainian forces that create the short-lived West Ukrainian Republic in 1918-19. So these are reports by this man who is living in the town during that period. Then there is the diary of a Ukrainian gymnasium teacher who was in the town in World War II. And then there is a long report by a Jewish radio technician who was also in the town during World War II and the Holocaust, and ended up fighting in the ranks of a local Polish underground. So these are, in a sense, first-person histories within the framework of a local history. And if you read those accounts, then you gain much more insight into the dynamics of violence within these towns, both in World War I and in World War II. And as I'll say in a moment, World War I is quite crucial to this. A second book, and this is not the actual cover of it, although it'll look a little bit like that, is not out yet, and that's this book, Tales from the Borderlands, Making and Unmaking the Galician Past. And that is a book that really looks back in time into the formation of a certain type of borderland society in the Crese in Galicia, through stories, tales, poems, and personal accounts, and takes it from earlier period, 16th and 17th century, into the last generations born between 1848 and 1914, and concludes on a personal level with a transition of my own family from Galicia to Palestine in the mid-1930s. That was a transition that was obviously irreversible, because one could not go back anymore once World War II happened. Most of the people in this photo, who are members of my family, were murdered. Only those who left survived. And the last book that I've only now, so this book is basically in production now. The last book that I'm now working on speaks about what I would see as the final part of this transition. And that is really about my own generation, that is those born in the years following World War II, between the late 40s and the early 1960s in Israel and the newly created state of Israel, and their own attempts, ongoing attempts to recreate the past that they were unaware of, both the past of where their families came from, and in my case, and the members of the generation that I talk about, it's the European past, not the Middle East past, and the place that they were born into, that is a Palestine or a state of Israel that had just been recently mostly emptied of its former population, that is the Palestinians who had lived there, and most of whom either fled or were expelled during the War of 1948. And that too, it will be based on personal accounts by Jewish and Arab members of that generation and how they understand their connection to that place and their connection to a very different past. So that's, if you like, the kind of larger framework within which I'm working at the moment. Now I'm going to focus much more on the case of Buchach. And at the end, as I said, I want to indicate why I think such studies are useful, important, and in many ways, I would say, can change our understanding both of the Holocaust as an historical event and of genocide and other types of mass violence more generally. So I began thinking about this study in the mid-1990s, and I did that in part because of the fact that in the 1990s, there were two major genocides. One, as you may know, was in the former Yugoslavia in Bosnia, starting in 1992. About possibly 250,000 people were killed, and they were often killed very intimately by their neighbors, by people they knew. And the second was in Rwanda in 1994, probably the fastest genocide in history. In about 10 weeks, about 800,000 people were murdered, mostly by machetes and by being set on fire in churches and so forth. And again, it was a very intimate case of genocide where many of the killers knew the people they were killing and vice versa. Now, the 1990s was also a period in which the Holocaust came into prominence in the sense that more people, historians, public opinion, began perceiving it as a major event in European history, in the history of World War II, in German history, and in the history of the 20th century, which was not the case before. This started in the 1980s. In the 1990s, there was increasing work on the Holocaust and increasing public interest in the Holocaust as the genocide of the Jews. And in 2000, there was also a sort of public recognition in Europe of that in a well-known conference in Stockholm. But the understanding of the Holocaust as it was coming into this kind of public prominence was of a case of industrial killing. That is a case in which the killing was done to the best, to the greatest extent, as far as the perpetrators were concerned, in a detached manner. that is separating between the killers and the killed, trying to make sure that the perpetrators were not directly engaged, or as little directly engaged as possible, in the gore of killing their victims. And that this process ultimately ended up in a sophisticated system of transportation over the entire continent to extermination camps, and extermination camps in which people were very quickly shorn of their hair, of their clothes, enclosed in gas chambers, quickly killed, and then either burnt, buried in mass graves, or cremated, or burnt in open fires, so that no trace of them remained. So in a sense, there was an understanding of the Holocaust as a case of industrial murder, creating factories of murder that produced corpses. Now, of course, already at the time, we knew that this was not all that happened in the Holocaust. That is, that about half of the victims of the Holocaust did not die that way. But how they died and what the dynamic of that killing was remained somewhat obscure. And that was something that I thought really needed to be understood, not least because of the kind of genocides that we had seen in the 1990s, whose nature was very different, although the result was largely the same. That is, mass murder of large numbers of civilian populations, including men, women, children, old people, and so forth. So in order to do that, I chose one town. Now, this, of course, brings me back to what I was saying before. You cannot do a study from below of the Holocaust for the entire Holocaust, because it was a vast event across an entire continent. Hundreds of thousands of people were directly involved in the killing. Much larger numbers of people were on the periphery of the killing, and millions of people were murdered. So I thought that the best way to try and understand this, what was the dynamic of these other kinds of killings, was to look at one place and to look as closely as possible at it. That is, to get all the information one could on this one individual place. And I chose the town of Buchach. This is a photograph from World War I. My initial question to myself then was the nature of the encounter between the perpetrators and the victims. That is, as I said before, there was an attempt by the Germans to distance themselves from the victims. And the extermination camp process was the culmination of that attempt. But that attempt didn't always succeed. In fact, in 50% of the cases, it did not. And so I asked myself, what was it? Was there contact? Was there an encounter between the victims and the perpetrators? And if so, what was the nature of that encounter? Now, I chose the town of Buchach, first of all, because it's in Eastern Europe. Right now, it's in West Ukraine. I'll show you some maps in a moment. And that was where most of the Jews lived before World War II. And that is where most of the Jews were murdered. So obviously, it was natural to choose a town like Buchach. It was also a town, like many, many towns across the borderland region, which I've called with my colleague Eric Weitz, my late colleague who recently tragically passed, Eric Weitz, in a book we edited, The Shatter Zone of Empires. That is, the entire region from the Baltics to the Balkans, the area where the empires, the great empires met, was a multi-ethnic region where most of the towns, small towns and cities, had multi-ethnic populations. And that was certainly the case in Buchach, which had a population of Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians, or Ruthenians as they were known at the time. So the first thing that I understood as I was looking at that town was that it was not, as the Jews like to think of it, a shtetl, that is a Jewish town. The Jewish part of the town was a shtetl, but it was a multi-ethnic town like hundreds of other towns across the region, from Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, and so forth. Now, I chose the town also because I knew something about it. It was the town from which a very famous writer came, Shmuel Yosef Agnon. Formerly, his real name was Chachkes. He changed his name to Agnon after he went to Palestine. And he not only came from the town and lived there until he was 21 years old, he also, much of what he wrote was about Buchach. And he wrote about Buchach not only as the town, but as a representative of the entire East European Jewish culture, particularly small town Jewish culture, that when he started writing was declining. He started writing before World War I. Much of his writing was in the interwar period. But by the time that he wrote his massive book on the history of Buchach, it's not a history book, but it's a kind of biography of the town, all that civilization had been entirely destroyed. And I read Agnon even as a teenager growing up in Israel, and therefore I knew his writing quite well. And so I thought if I am to write about some town in Eastern Europe, I might as well choose this one. You may know, of course, that other interesting people came from the town who are relevant to the story, not least Immanuel Ringelblum, who, as many of you hopefully know, was an important interwar historian of Polish-Jewish relations, and then was the founder of the Oneg Shabbat, or Oneg Shabbos archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, thanks to which we know much more than we would otherwise have known about that ghetto that was entirely destroyed and of which nothing remains. And Simon Wiesenthal also came from the town, and Simon Wiesenthal, known later on as the Nazi hunter, actually also tried to hunt down the people who were engaged in the murder of the Jews of Buchach specifically. And I found quite a number of his materials in his so-called archive in Vienna, which is really a two-bedroom apartment, or was when I was there. And finally, I chose this town also because my own family came from there. My mother spent the first years of her life there. She was actually born in Koszmierzyn, Kosmeren, in a little village of Dniester. But when she was about 1 year old, they moved to Buchach, and she grew up in Buchach and was there until 1935. And that was important to me, obviously, on a personal level, but it was also important as, I would say, as an entry point into an intimate history of a place. Because what I increasingly understood I wanted to do, and that was not immediately obvious to me, was not simply to do a local history, but also to do what I would call a history not only from below, but also from within. That is a history with which you as an author, as an historian, empathize, that you create a sense of empathy with the people of the town, the voices of the people who are reporting from that town. And one entry point to that, of course, is one's own personal connection. I, of course, was born in Israel in the 1950s, and therefore I went there for the first time when I was in my 40s. But the sense that I could have been born there, that my family had come from there, became something that helped me in crafting this work, in gaining this kind of personal connection to the place. Now, I'll tell you just a few things about the location and history that I trace in Anatomy of a Genocide. So Buchach, as you can see here, was sort of on the southern borderlands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It served as one of a series of fortified towns to ward off invasions from the east by Cossacks and Tatars, and from the south by the Ottoman Empire, and it experienced a great deal of violence during the Khmelnytsky uprising in the mid-17th century, and then was actually conquered by an Ottoman army later on in the 17th century. So it was one of a chain of borderland fortified towns in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But in 1772, with the first partition of Poland, it became part of the newly created province of Galicia, Galicia. And it was really on the eastern part of eastern Galicia, not far from the Russian border. And Galicia, that now Austrian province, was the poorest, easternmost, and densely populated province of Austro-Hungary, what became Austro-Hungary. And it was also a province that had the largest concentration of Ruthenians, of Ukrainians, who were the majority there, and the largest concentration of Jews in the Habsburg Empire. Now, as I was trying to understand the long trajectory of that history, I'd say that some of the questions that I began asking myself had to do with an interview that I conducted with my mother in the mid-1990s, in 1995. As I was talking with her and as she was relating to me, telling me about her childhood, I realized that in large part that first question that I asked myself about the encounter between Jews and Germans, that is the perpetrators and the victims, was an insufficient question, in the sense that there was a longer history of inter-ethnic relations in Buchach, as in many other towns, that I had to understand in order to see what was the social dynamic during the Holocaust in Buchach, and in many other towns, of course. That is, that it was not only a case of the Germans coming to a remote town someplace in Osten and killing the Jews, but that the way it happened largely reflected a long trajectory of relations between the different ethnic groups. Now, as I said, for about 400 years, Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews lived side by side in that town. And in the 17th century, there was a great deal of violence in that area. But as of 1700 or so, this is not a violent area until 1914, until World War I erupts. However, in the late 19th century, a new kind of nationalism arrives in that area. And the national rhetoric in that area increasingly creates tension between the different groups, the three main ethnic religious groups there. I can't go into all the details of that, but I will just say that as part of the Polish national rhetoric for the Kresy and for this area is very much of Poland as having come as a civilizing force to those far-flung, more primitive parts of the East, that they were civilizing and bringing culture, commerce to. In a response to, largely in response to this Polish nationalist rhetoric, is a Ukrainian national rhetoric that becomes increasingly prevalent in the last decades of the 19th century and the early 20th century, which presents the Ukrainian population as having been colonized by the Poles and subjected to Polish exploitation, which is done in large part by assistance by the Jewish lackeys, by the Jews that they invited to these areas in order to develop towns, commerce, to run their estates, mills, and so forth. And so there are two very different national narratives about this area, which are both ethnic nationalist and territorial nationalist. And the one thing that they agree on when they talk about their projected futures, the kind of future nation states that they would like to create once they're rid of the empire that they belong to, the one thing they agree on is that there would not be any place for Jews there because they belong to neither of these narratives. And the Jews who begin also quite belatedly to create their own national, ethno-national, and territorial nationalism, which ends up largely in that era as being Zionism, and they borrow much of that from Polish and Ukrainian nationalism. They perceive themselves, these Zionists, as having to realize their own nationalist dreams, not on the land of Galicia, not in these parts. They don't make a claim on the territory there, but rather to take it overseas to Palestine and to create a Jewish nation state there. And that's part of the story, as I said, that I will write on at some other point that I'm actually beginning to write now. Now, after World War I, with the fall of the empire and the creation, as was hoped for, of a new or resurrected Polish state, this time a Polish nation state, and with the defeat of the Ukrainian effort to create an independent state in West Ukraine, the Poland that is created is a Poland whose eastern territories, this area of Volhynia and Galicia, is an area where Poles are a minority. In the area of Galicia, in these parts, the majority is Ruthenian, Ukrainian, and it's increasingly suppressed by the Polish state and increasingly responding to that suppression by increasing violence, organization, finally the creation of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists of OUN in 1929, which is largely a terrorist underground sworn to create an independent Ukraine that is free of both Poles and of Jews. If we look at the historical trajectory, this continues until 1939, and in 1939, this area, including, of course, Buchach, is taken over by the Soviet Union as part of the agreement between Stalin and Hitler on the partition of Eastern Europe, partition of Poland. And the Soviets who take this area over conduct their own policies of suppression, of deportations, and of nationalization of the economy. So they greatly impoverish the economy, which was already quite weak in that area. And as part of their policies, they create increasing or exacerbate the existing inter-ethnic tensions between the groups. They first deport large numbers of Poles, then they deport large numbers of Jews, and then they deport, incarcerate, and ultimately kill large numbers of Ukrainian nationalists in local jails, just as the Germans then attacked the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941. And the Germans, when they then march into that area, they recreated as District Galicia, which is then connected to the general government. And in that area, much of what they are engaged in is the mass murder of the Jewish population, which begins about a year after they march in and largely ends, although not entirely, by the following summer, by summer 1943. Now, just to give you a little bit of an idea, those of you who don't know, when the Germans march into this area, what happens is that as the Soviets retreat, the NKVD decides to execute all the political prisoners in local jail. These are not photographs from Buchach, these are from Lemberg, from Lviv. And they then, after executing thousands of political prisoners, they retreat. And even before the Germans come in, there is a series of pogroms, not only in Lemberg and Lviv, but in many other towns. And those target particularly Jews who are blamed to have collaborated with the Soviets in the killing of Ukrainian patriots. And that sets a pattern for mass violence in this area, large-scale violence from July 1941 until beyond the return of the Red Army in spring-summer 1944. And in towns such as Buchach, Buchach is taken over by Ukrainian militia, an armed militia, many of whose members are former UPA members, OUN members, members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. The Ukrainians generally welcome the arrival of the Germans in that area because they are liberating them as they see it from Polish oppression. And they hope, of course, that the Germans would allow the creation of an independent Ukraine. That does not happen. The Germans have no interest in creating an independent Ukraine, but they're very happy to cooperate with Ukrainian organizations, both in recruiting them, as they eventually do in 1943, into the SS, and more importantly, recruiting them into police units that facilitate the killing of the Jewish population in that area. And the killing of the Jewish population in that area is conducted largely by outposts of the security police. So in the case of Buchach, there's an outpost in the nearby town of Chortkov or Chortkiv, which numbers about 20 men. They are members of the security police, some are Gestapo, Kripo, SS, SD. Some are German, some are not German, but ethnic German from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania. And those men, in the period between summer of 1942, in the case of Buchach, from the fall of 1942 to early summer 1943, killing Buchach itself an estimated 10,000 Jews. And in the area that this group of men is responsible for, which is the Buchach-Chortkov area, they murder a total of 60,000 Jews. These 20 men who, as you can see, because they're very comfortable in that area, they have easy access to anything they want, be it food, alcohol, tobacco, sex. They bring their families over, or their local mistresses, their children, their parents. They have a very enjoyable life there, as well as conducting mass murder. But clearly they cannot conduct this kind of mass murder over a large territory in towns that are quite separate from each other without massive local assistance. And that local assistance comes to them from auxiliary police units. So in Chortkov, these 20 policemen have also over 300 auxiliary police members who are Ukrainian, plus police units in each town, Ukrainian police units, German uniformed police, gendarmerie, as well as Jewish police, who facilitate the organization of people for this kind of mass murder. And the trajectory of the killing itself is such that it's exactly the opposite of what we have read about how the Holocaust occurred. That is, there is an early moment of killing just when the Germans arrived in August 1941, when they killed the intelligentsia, about 450 members of the white-collar professions in Buchach, and they do the same in other towns. And then there's a lull, and there's no killing for a long period of time, in the case of Buchach, until October 1942. And during that period, one group gets to know the other one very well, because the Jews are employed by the Germans as cooks, as doctors, as dentists, as babysitters, as cleaners, tailors, carpenters. They come in and out of German homes. This includes German police and other German administrative staff. And in investigations carried out by the West German police, particularly in the late 50s and throughout the 1960s, we hear accounts by members of the German administration in this area who speak specifically about the Jews they knew by name, who they then, of course, also saw being killed if they did not participate directly in their killing. Once the killing begins in October 1941, there are two deportations to Belzec, the designated extermination camp of that area. Those are very violent events in which hundreds of people are killed on the street before they are pushed into the trains. But in December 1942, Belzec closes down, and the rest of the killing throughout 1943 is carried out in situ in two sites around the town of Buchach. So if you look at this aerial photo of the town, you can see the two main sites of the killing are the Fedor Hill, which is here, and the Jewish Cemetery Hill, which is here. The town is right in the middle here. And so both sides, this side can be seen from here and vice versa. Both can be seen from the center of town, and any shooting that occurs there can be heard in the middle of town. The train station is further out here. And so everything happens within a very small space, very publicly, and everyone can see and hear what is occurring. This was initially investigated by the Soviet Extraordinary Commission in 1945, who dug up some of the mass graves. But even the final report of this commission was already, the formulation of things was already changed because of ideological pressure at the top, so that instead of this being the case of Jews being killed by the Germans with collaboration of the locals, it ends up being presented as innocent Soviet citizens being murdered by the fascist dogs. And the actual nature of the events, which was investigated initially, already disappears from the final version of the report. Now, it's important to understand, too, that once most of the Jews have been killed, although there are still thousands of Jews in Galicia who are either in labor camps or in hiding, the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which is created in 1943 and is the armed wing of the OUN, begins ethnic cleansing, first of Volhynia, and then in early 1944, comes into Galicia and begins massive ethnic cleansing of the Polish population there, as well as hunting down any Jews that they still can find. And they participate in killings that the Germans at this point are less interested in doing, because Jews are hiding in areas that the Germans don't particularly want to go into, in remote villages and forests. To complete this kind of historical aspect, I'll say that what most of the Ukrainians living in this area today, or even just decades ago, remember from that is what occurred when the Red Army returned. When the Red Army returned, there was a Ukrainian insurgency. The only people who really felt that they were liberated by the Red Army were the few Jews who remained there. The Ukrainian population did not see it as a liberation, but rather as a reoccupation. There was a great deal of resistance, a very violent insurgency, and the Soviets responded with mass killings and deportations to Central Asia and to gulags. And this is really part of the local memory of these events, the most important aspect of it, the liberation war against the Soviet Union that ultimately succeeds in 1991. There is less memory of such individuals as Volodymyr Kaznovsky, who was the Ukrainian head of the police in Buchach and who had a great deal of blood on his hands, formerly a district attorney in that area. Of the 8,000 Jews who had lived in Buchach before World War II, this is about as many as remained alive. There are about 60 people here. They put up a memorial, but that memorial was removed shortly thereafter by the Soviets. It does not exist anymore. There is one lone memorial in the forest for the very first killing of the intelligentsia, very hard to find. There's no signpost leading to it. There is, however, a prominent memorial to those freedom fighters that I mentioned before, to Ukrainian freedom fighters, very close to the area where the unmarked mass graves of the Jewish population of the town are located. And now, of course, there's also a memorial to Stepan Bandera that was put up maybe 10 years ago, so a bit less than 10 years ago. The Jewish cemetery for decades was totally deserted. However, a couple of years ago, it was surrounded by a wall. This was an initiative by a Jewish group. So it's slightly more protected now. But if you look here, when you're standing on the Jewish cemetery hill here, you can see the Fedor Hill on the other side. These are the two main sites of the killing, and the town is between these two hills. And the last remaining structure in Buchach, which was the study house, the Bet HaMidrash, all the other synagogues were destroyed, including the Great Synagogue, was demolished in 2001 to make room for a new shopping center. Now, so what we have now is, of course, a revival of Ukrainian nationalism, partly because of the Russian invasion from the east. And as you can see, the flag that I saw flying over the remnants of the medieval Polish castle of the town of the Zamek is the flag of UPA, which doesn't exist, but symbolizes Ukrainian nationalism. Now, with your permission, I want to just go over a few summarizing points of why I think this is useful. This kind of study is useful. And as I said, it took me a long time to reconstruct all of this. Since I started in 1995, it's been a couple of decades. So let me briefly say why I think it's important. The first thing is, I would say that what such studies show is that the Holocaust was only in part a case of industrial killing, and that, as I mentioned earlier, in fact, about half of the Jewish victims were killed where they lived. And that's a very important statement because it makes us rethink a whole lot of what we think about the Holocaust, including what arguments about the so-called uniqueness of the Holocaust. In what way is it different, and in what way is it similar to other cases of genocide, certainly modern genocide. Secondly, it shows, as I think will have become clear to you by now, that the killing was not secret and was not anonymous. It was public and it was intimate. The victims knew the killers and vice versa, and that the killing took place in and around the town, and that everybody could see and hear what was going on. So debates that occurred in Germany for many years about who knew and was it secret are really not relevant to such cases of local genocide, because everybody saw and everybody heard, and everybody who was not targeted often also profited from the killing, as I will mention in a moment. It also shows that the distinction that we tend to make between perpetrators, victims, and bystanders doesn't apply in such towns, and there are hundreds of such towns. there were only, I would say, degrees of engagement, ranging from total cooperation with the perpetrators to rescue and resistance on the other hand, with most people being somewhere in between. But the idea that there were people just standing by, bystanders, really doesn't hold in such cases. It shows, I would say, also that our predilection to distinguish between good and evil is greatly undermined when we look at the Holocaust from below, because often the same people who were good at one point, who we would classify as good, let's say they give shelter to those who are being hunted down, could be participants in the killing at another point, and vice versa. And this often happens, that people shelter certain individuals for a while, and then they might denounce them or kill them themselves. It's also important to understand, when you look at these local cases, that survival depended on others. It was almost impossible to survive without people helping you. So most of those, the vast majority of those who survived, of the few who survived, were helped not by one, but often by many other people. But the dying also often depended on denunciations by others. So that in this kind of tight social fabric, your chances to survive and your chances of being found up really depend on your neighbors. It shows also, I would say, that the killing could only be accomplished by the collaboration, by large-scale collaboration by the local population. This does not mean that the Germans would not have tried to carry out mass genocide anyway. They would have. And it does not mean that the local population would have carried out such a genocide had the Germans not arrived. But the combination of the two, of the German will to murder the Jews and the finding of willing collaborators quite easily facilitated this kind of very efficient and rapid killing in a large rural region. It shows, I would say, that questions about motivation that interested me very much in my early study of the Wehrmacht. Why were German soldiers motivated to fight the Red Army as they did, and why they, under very harsh conditions, and to what extent this had to do with the ideological indoctrination, that doesn't apply so much to the people I studied here. There was never a problem getting members of the security police to participate in mass killing. In fact, there were volunteers beyond what they needed, and this comes out again and again in their interrogation. So some of the questions raised by Christopher Browning in his book, Ordinary Men, also don't really apply here. There was never any case of people being reluctant to participate in the killing. Just a few final points. I'd say that it shows that on the local level, all people, all groups saw themselves and remember themselves, and in many ways still remember themselves as a group, as victims, and particularly as victims of their own neighbors. And that applies to Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews. I can elaborate more later on, but it's a very strong element of the collective memory, as well as the social reality at the time. I'd say finally that clearly, in order to reconstruct such events, we have to rely on personal accounts. Obviously, there are many issues with personal accounts, testimonies, diaries, and so forth, and we can talk about those, but we cannot reconstruct much of what happened without relying on personal accounts, because if we rely only on perpetrator documents, then we lose much of what actually happened on the ground. If we don't have a clear understanding of those events, because the Germans didn't care about them, didn't know about them, and they were irrelevant to them. And yet they were at the core of how the event both occurred, was experienced, and was remembered. I'd say that when you look then at personal accounts by Poles and Ukrainians, one striking element is that they were mostly not concerned with what happened to the Jews. They're mostly concerned with each other because, as I said, immediately after the mass murder of the Jews, the ethnic cleansing of the Poles begins, and there is also a great deal of resistance by Poles, armed Polish units, and much of the recollection of that period by Poles and Ukrainians is either of the struggle with each other, or certainly in the case of Ukrainians, then of the struggle against the Soviets. I'd say a couple of last points then. That when you look at local genocide, you realize the extent to which so much of it is about property. That even people who are, I'd say, sorry about what happens to their neighbors and would have rather not seen it happen will then partake of the property, because these are poor places where if you don't take your neighbor's property, somebody else will, or certainly the organizers of the genocide will. And that question of property then also plays an important role in how people remember the event, what they want to remember, and what they want to conceal. I'd say that the last point I want to make is that what I have increasingly felt over certainly the last few years is that when you study a case such as Buchach, where for 400 years, as I said, people lived side by side, and largely they were not killing each other. They were going to school together, they were working together, they were in the marketplace together, they often spoke each other's languages. These were not segregated communities. What it teaches you is how thin the crust of civilization, of order, of security actually is, and that it depends largely on law and law enforcement, and that once a certain group then is seen as beyond the limits of the law, once you begin to break that thin crust, then everything that you could not believe would happen happens. And I'll finish with this. My sense when listening and reading personal accounts, interviewing people, was that people said two contradictory things. They said, first, we could not believe it when we saw what was happening. It was absolutely unbelievable that this would happen. And in the same breath, they say, we always knew it would happen. And it was that sense that something was about to erupt, and yet when it did, it was impossible to believe that it would. And I think that for us in our own societies, we always have to remember how thin the crust of civilization, of order, and of security that we live on it really is. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and I'll be very glad to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this fascinating and I think that very important lecture. I'm very happy that we had this lecture at the Poland Museum at this time also, and I'm happy that I hope that this lecture could be a part what is a general discussion that is occurring here in Poland about how much did the Poles knew about the Holocaust during the war. And I hope that this discussion will be very lively. And I forgot one more thing to add at the beginning. I forgot to add that this lecture was a part of the workshop that is going on in Poland Museum, a workshop that is entitled After the Void, New Perspectives on the Shtetl in the Post-War Polish, Belarusian, Ukrainian Borderland. So forgive me for this omission. And as we could suspect, we have questions from the audience. So we have about 20 minutes left for the discussion. But the first question is about the survivors, and did they still face the violence after the liberation? Do we know how many of them, if any at all, remained in Bucha after 1944? Yeah, so this would be the first question.
Yes, so there were, thank you, and thank you for the question. There were very few survivors. As I said, there were about 60 survivors. Tragically, at the case of Buchach, in March 1944, the Red Army took over Buchach, and about 800 survivors came out of hiding either in the town or in surrounding villages. They were obviously in very bad condition. However, 2 weeks later, the Wehrmacht launched a counteroffensive and took over Buchach and remained there until July 1944. And during that period, they killed almost all the Jewish survivors. Those who couldn't flee with the Red Army, and most people were in no shape to flee with the Red Army, and the Red Army was not particularly keen on taking them along. And so there were only about 60 survivors. Those survivors mostly left within a year. There were very, very few people who stayed. And the main reason, well, there were many reasons to leave, but the main reason was that they, this happened in many places after the Holocaust. People who survived, say they were in Russia and this area is being taken over by the Red Army, went back to the towns to see if any members of their family survived. And that happened also in Buchach, but people could not move into their houses. They were told that they would be killed. So their property was taken over. They were all living in one building, those survivors, and obviously it was dangerous to be either in the town and in the countryside. And so within a year, most of them either went west to Poland or went south. Quite a number of people went to Czernowitz and then to Bucharest and so forth. So there were just very, very few people who stayed and kept certain posts in the town under Soviet rule.
Thank you. And the second question is, to what extent the dynamic of violence and the grades of implication in Buchach are universal for the whole Nazi-occupied Soviet territory, and how much of it is determined by the regional characteristic of Eastern Galicia?
That's a great question. I don't think that we can answer it so easily. There are local dynamics, and local dynamics are regional, and they're even specific to each town. So I think that we have to differentiate between what is in common, and I think there's certain elements that are in common, and what is different. In the case of Galicia, I would say that Buchach is quite representative of many other towns in Galicia because of the dynamic that I talked about of tensions between, not just tensions, but also mutual killing between Poles and Ukrainians because of a growing anti-Jewish sentiment within the Ukrainian national movement, because of the Polish state's growing anti-Semitic policies toward Jews in the 1930s. So there are specific elements in Galicia. I think that if you move to in Belarus, there's some differences that we can talk about. I don't want to start elaborating on that. In Lithuania, there are differences in, as you know, in the Baltic. The killing of the Jews was very quick. Most of the Jews were murdered very, very quickly. So if there is local collaboration there, quite a bit, a local initiative in killing Jews, but most of the Jews are killed much faster. And if you move to Soviet Ukraine again, you get a somewhat different dynamic. But it's very difficult to generalize too much. I would say that the best way to figure that out is to do a few more local studies with that in mind. What is the relationship? Now, I'll say one last thing, which is, to me, very important. There is a difference in the dynamic in the case of Buchach, which was in Poland until 1939, and towns in Poland, which were not did not have that characteristic of having a Ukrainian majority. Because what you see in Galicia is a triangular relationship. It's Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish. What you see in much of the heartland of Poland is more a Jewish-Polish relationship. And so one result of that, if you want to talk about the particularities of this area, of this region, is that it appears, although you can't really fully prove it, that Jews were more likely to be helped by Poles in Galicia, in Eastern Galicia, than by Ukrainians. That's not because Poles in East Galicia were nicer than Poles in central Poland, but because Poles were also being hunted down increasingly. And so there seems to have been an element of empathy with Jews in that region, which may not have been at all the case in other parts of Poland. So that's why the regional is also very important.
Thank you. Now a question from me. I was wondering, because you went very far, even during the presentation in time, very far. Even in the presentation, you could see a Polish cavalry, a hussar, and I find this very important for the Holocaust scholars, especially, to look at the previous periods and to look for reasons of people's behavior during the war, also at that time. And of course, the anti-Jewish violence before the war is a very obvious source from which we can understand a lot. But I was wondering how far should we go back in order to understand what is happening during the Second World War in Buchach? Because I understand you mentioned Rwanda, and this is an easier example because we can created nation or two nations created by Europeans, and we can start from this point, and then the story goes. And I was wondering how far should we go when we investigate the history of Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian relations in order to understand what was going on during the war.
Look, I mean, I think there is what Mark Bloch called, the cult of origins, that all historians want to go to what was before. And before that, there was something else before that. So in some ways, you want to go back as far as you can, but you can't. So I would say the reason I'm interested in the Hussars and all that is not so much because that has a direct correlation to what happens in the 20th century, much more so because of the way it's reinvented and reimagined in the 19th century. The 19th century creates the kind of national narratives that are operative in the 20th century, and in fact are operative right now. And Poland is one example of that. It's a good example or a bad example, it's up to you, but it's a strong example, but it's everywhere. It's the same in the country that I come from, in Israel. So these narratives created in the 19th century harken back to earlier periods. And in there, people, the nationalizers, represent the past in a certain way to their people that explains to them not the past, but the present and what they want the future to look like. And in that sense, it's important, first of all, to know what the past really was, as much as we can say, and how it differed from how the nationalizers wanted to present it, and then how that past operated in actually triggering people to behave in a certain way. So when Jews in World War I, in a pogrom, say, Khmelnytsky, they don't know much about Khmelnytsky, but for them, that's the call of pogrom, right? That's what they recall. And for Poles in the 1940s or in 1920, 1919, when they are thinking about fighting against Ukrainians, they in their minds, because of what they read, because of what they studied in school, very deeply, sort of insistently, maybe not deeply, but were indoctrinated into it, they're thinking about the 17th century. And so it's not the real 17th century, but it's the one that becomes part of the national narrative.
Okay, we have another question from the audience, and I will connect this with mine, because the question is, have you been, so because you mentioned that you would like to have your book published into Ukrainian, the question is, have you been approached by a published house from Ukraine, or your publisher was approached. And my question would be, what is the memory of Bučac from before 1939 in present Bučac?
Okay, so no, I have not, but I have approached some because I would like the book to come out in Ukrainian. And I know many Ukrainian scholars read Polish. The book is available in Polish. They can read it, but I would like it to come out in Ukrainian. But I've not, and I've been in touch with some publishers, and they come up with various reasons why this may not be the right time to do so. Look, I mean, there are also, other issues that have to do with the finance and so forth, but I think there is discomfort with this book. And I was very glad that it came out in Poland, on the other hand, and by and large, it was well received. Obviously, there must have been people who hated it, but they've not written about it as far as I can see. In terms of Bučac, what is remembered in contemporary Bučac of pre-World War II Bučac, I would say nothing. Now, let me qualify this a tiny bit, because there are a number of younger people, some in Bučac, particularly one individual, and some in Lviv, who have been trying to create a memory of that past. So there is now a small museum. It's not really a museum, but a small sort of cultural location that is in where Agnon is supposed to have lived, although it's probably not the right place. And there's a little monument that was put up in 2016, a bust of Agnon. The street was renamed Ulica Agnona sometime before that already. So there was some agreement to celebrate Agnon. But of course, Agnon won the Nobel Prize, and he's presented as a Ukrainian Nobel Prize winner. So there is national pride in Agnon. That's a little bit like the debate about Bruno Schulz. Who does he belong to? So, but there is very little, if any, memory of both Jewish and Polish life in Bučac before the war. The Roman Catholic Church was renovated. It was used by the Soviets as a storage, but it was renovated by the old priest who came back after 1991. He has died, meanwhile, Father Rutina. But otherwise, there's almost no memory. And the past, as far as I can tell, from my last conversations there, is not taught in the gymnasium. And the gymnasium was very much a Polish Jewish gymnasium. It does not teach the past of its own town. And that's not only in Bučac. Many young Ukrainians I spoke with tell me that's more generally the case in many of these smaller towns.
Yeah, thank you. So, no questions from the audience, but I will have one more because this is particularly interesting for me. There's one thing that emerges from your research, and what is very important, and a thing that people often forget about, is that the behavior or the attitude of the actors of what was going on during the Holocaust changes during the time. So the perpetrator could be a victim at one moment. And as far as I understand, many of those testimonies that you investigated are very moving ones. But I would like you to tell us what was the most horrifying or most, surprising discovery of a perpetrator or a victim, a changing of factors during that time.
There's not one example because I've seen so many. I think altogether about 250 Jewish testimonies, and then scores of Polish testimonies and quite a number of Ukrainians. So it's a bit hard, but let me I'll mention two. One is by a young Jewish girl. She was then about 10. And there's actually two testimonies by her, and they were given right after the event, one in Czernowitz and then one in Bucharest. One in Polish with a lot of Ukrainian in it, and one in German. That story is a story of rescue. She is taken in by a Polish peasant woman to her village, and there she survives. But while she's in that village, she's also, by all appearances from her testimony, being sexually abused by the Ukrainian brother-in-law of this woman. And her account is extraordinarily moving. And it's by a girl who cannot quite articulate what she's going through. So in some ways you see the events through her eyes. And so it's a story of rescue and a story of abuse at the same time. And also she has conversations with many of the Polish women there who, she's an educated girl, although she's very young. So they see her as someone they can speak with. And she reports how they talk about how wretched and violent their own lives are. So it's a very, very moving account, and it shows you exactly this kind of ambiguity of it all. And the woman who protects her also shouts at her and tells her that she's going to kill them all. So she abuses her, but she saves her at the same time. So that's one account that I found really moving. Another case is just a case that I like because it also shows that everybody had a choice, even in these kind of situations. What we were taught were choices. There were choices, and these choices mattered. And that's the case that I write about at the end of the book. There was a case of a German army officer who ended up in Tovce, which is not far from Buchach. He saw that by then the security police was gone from the area. They didn't want to stay there when the fighting came. And there were still Jews either in labor camps or hiding. And he sees them being killed by all kinds of forces, by Ukrainian paramilitary forces, by local bandits, by the peasants. And he is appalled by that. This is a Wehrmacht officer who is coming from the Eastern Front, who probably has a lot of blood on his hands. And he tells the Jews in Tovce that he's going to protect them until the Red Army arrives. And the rumor of that passes through the forest, and Jews start converging on the town. And 600 Jews end up in that town to be protected by this German officer. Now, we don't know about that from him. We know about it from them, from their accounts. We don't even know his name. And he stays there until 2 hours or so before the Red Army moves in. And so for me, this is a story where you can tell somebody made a decision and he saved people. And because he saved people, we know of what he did because they testified. They could because they were alive to testify. And for me, this was very moving because I had also personally, because I had written about, the barbarization of warfare, and there was a great deal of it. And none of this takes away the barbarization, but here was one man who at some point decided he's going to save people, and he did.
I think I missed one question. I need to look at it. Yeah. The question was about local Roma and Gypsies. What is similar and what is the difference in the history of comparing to Jews in Buchach area in World War II?
I have to admit that I've seen no evidence of Roma in that area. There were some ethnic Germans, also very few, and there are some accounts of ethnic Germans as another minority, and those are not good stories. And there are quite a number of Poles who declare themselves to be ethnic Germans under the Germans. That's a whole other story that can be told. But I have not found any evidence of Roma in that area. It doesn't mean that there weren't any, but it's not mentioned anywhere in my sources.
Mm. Okay, thank you. I think we are ending at the time that we're supposed to end. So thank you, Professor Bartow, once again for your fascinating lecture. And I would just like to thank also all those who watched us and listened to us. And I wanted to inform you that the lecture is recorded and will be available later on also. And I encourage you to look at the page of the Polymuseum and track down the upcoming distinguished lectures in autumn of this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye, bye-bye.